to this new seminar with Dr. Jerome Kassirer. I know it's not easy to come to attend an event tonight because of the weather conditions, and so I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. Jerome Kassirer, PhD and MD, Dr. Jerome Kassirer served as the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine from 1991 to 1999. He is currently a distinguished professor of medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine, where he has also served as vice chairman of the Department of Medicine. He has served on the American College of Physicians Board of Governors and Board of Regents, chaired the National Library of Medicine's Board of Scientific Counselors, and is past chairman of the American Board of Internal Medicine. He is a member of the Association of American Physicians, the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Kassirer's current interests are reliable approaches to the assessment of the quality of healthcare, professionalism, ethical scientific conduct, and patient involvement in decision-making. He has been highly critical of for-profit medicine, abuses of managed care, and political intrusion into medical decision-making. His latest book, which was assigned for the seminar for the Center for Global Humanities seminar, and it has been read by a number of students and also members of the audience, whose title is On the Take, How Medicine's Complicity with Big Business Can Endanger Your Health, was published by Oxford University in 2004. He has also published extensively on nephrology, medical decision-making, and the diagnostic process. And one of the perks of having to welcome scholars and speakers of the caliber of Dr. Jerome Kassirer is to hear little stories about their interests. And one of them, he just told me in December, he spent a week in Marrakesh, he and his family, and he liked it. Thank you. I thought my president would be happy to hear that. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Jerome Kassirer.
Good evening, everybody. The drive from Boston was not so bad. It was a little rainy, but there wasn't much traffic, and it was an easy drive. I'm really quite accustomed to the drive because I drive up to Cape Porpoise all the time, where my wife and I have a little house. So thank you for coming, and you can interrupt me anytime. It would be hard for me to be derailed, having given this talk a number of times. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end as well. And I have plenty of time, so let's get started. So do you know what your cholesterol is by any chance, or your LDL? And are you trying to lower it? Most people are, at least. Yeah, the gray hairs, at least in the audience. And are you taking statins? Do you know about the cholesterol guidelines? And I'll talk about this a little bit more. And do you know who developed them? And lastly, do you trust the advice of the people who developed the guidelines? So let me tell you a little bit about guidelines. Guidelines in medicine are recommendations made by generally an august society, such as the American Heart Association or the American College of Cardiology, and they're made specifically to help doctors make difficult decisions when the evidence around the decision is not quite clear. So what actually happened is that the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology got together in one of their rare détentes, and they developed guidelines based on the most recent studies. So guidelines are repeatedly done when there's new data. And the new data were, by the way, it was also the National Institutes of Health that were part of the guideline development, NIH, AHA, and ACC, and they had reviewed these particular double-blind control trials. Now, take my word for it that these are reasonable, evidence-based studies. And this is the panel of people who reviewed these studies and made the recommendations, and they're pretty widely recognized experts in cardiology and lipid metabolism. So, you know, we have people like Scott Grundy from Southwestern Medical School, Honey Hockey, who used to be at the University of Minnesota, Richard Pasternak at Man's Greatest Hospital. That's the Mass General, by the way. And so forth. So a lot of very prominent folks who collaborated to write these guidelines that physicians would use in the day-to-day care of patients. And the recommendation was that for people who were high risk, they should eat less, lose weight, exercise more, and take statins. The interesting thing is that at the very same time that the Americans were writing these guidelines, a group of Canadians at the University of British Columbia were also writing the guidelines based on virtually the same studies. And their conclusions were different. They concluded that statins were never proved to prevent heart disease in otherwise healthy people, even with higher than normal risks. Here we have the Americans on the one hand who are recommending statins, the Canadians on the other hand who said there's no data to propose the statins are useful. So how do you interpret that? Well, this is the disclosure statement of the Americans. And what I did is I underlined the companies that the authors of the American guidelines had relations with the companies that made statin drugs. So what you see is that Grundy, for example, had either honoraria. This is, by the way, not research support. This is honoraria, personal money that went into their pocketbooks. Oh, their wallets, actually, their mails. He had received honoraria from Merck, Pfizer, Koss, Bristol-Myers Squibb, and AstraZeneca, 5 companies that made statins. And when you put the data together, this is what they look like. So there are 9 people that wrote the guidelines. And of those 9 people, 7 of them had financial conflicts of interest with 5 to 7 of 3 to 5 of the companies that made statins. And then later, it turned out that these guidelines were questioned and that the evidence base for the guidelines recommendations made by the Americans were much more suspect. So here you have the Americans who are conflicted because they're getting money for honoraria, speaking engagements, and consultations from industry that made the drugs that they're recommending. And the Canadians saying that the stuff doesn't work. By the way, later data showed that the statins are pretty good. They do work. But I'm showing you data from 2004 when that wasn't known. So the drug company spends an enormous amount of money on advertising. This was $24 billion. This is billions, not millions. And when you sit in front of the television set and see all the ads for Viagra and Cialis and those other things that the other old guys use, you imagine that all that advertising is coming at lay people. In fact, it's not. 88%, almost 90% of the drug money that's spent on advertising is directed at doctors. And they seduce the doctors in various ways with meals and trips and gadgets and office materials, free samples. Personalized items. You could go in, at least at the time, to a medical meeting and get a piece of luggage with your name on it that was courtesy of a drug company. Of course, it has a drug on it too, but if you like that, it was okay. And free continuing medical education. So one day at a medical meeting, I was going up the escalator and noticed the lanyards that the doctors were wearing, and this is one, and actually this is the same thing. And so I asked them when I gave a talk similar to this, why would you wear something like that? Why would you be willing to be an advertisement for a drug company? There was no answer. So how widespread is this involvement by physicians in an industry? Well, we don't really know. But there are a couple of interesting surveys that have been published since I put this slide together. One of them in the journal JAMA, in which they took the list of the AMA physicians, some 600,000 or 700,000 physicians in the AMA list, and randomly selected 1,600 of them. And it turned out that about 85% had taken some kind of gift from industry. Now, the interesting thing is that 18% of them had personal money from the industry for speaking or for consulting. This is 18% of physicians at large. And another survey done by the same group that was published the same year in the New England Journal was a survey of department chairs. And what they found was that of the department chairs, 25% of internists and psychiatrists had taken personal money from one drug company or another. And the interesting thing is that when you questioned them, they asked them specifically whether they thought that taking that money would influence what they do. And virtually all said no. So my views about financial conflict of interest are based on one assumption and four principles. The assumption is that even small gifts influence behavior. And the principles are that financial considerations should never influence physician decision-making, either in clinical care or research. That medical information should be free of bias from any kind of financial inducements. That the profession should be accountable for an inordinately high cost of care. So to the extent that a drug rep comes into a physician's office, gives them the most expensive drug and wants them to use it, that's not being consistent with appropriate use of medical resources. And lastly, that all financial arrangements should be open and transparent. But interesting, when I talk to doctors, they believe that they can't be influenced by it. There's even one example in my book of a physician who got $1 million for a project and said that he couldn't be influenced. You know, I can understand why they say that, because they're trained in the scientific method. They're trained, we now have a religious adherence to evidence. We have a whole discipline called evidence-based medicine. And so physicians really believe that they can't be influenced. Well, what do the facts show? So this is a very clever little survey done by a group of people at the University of California at San Francisco. They passed around a survey and asked their colleagues whether they personally could be influenced by the largesse of industry. Then they also asked them whether they thought their colleagues could be influenced. So this is what the data showed. Actually, 40% of them said that they thought they personally could be influenced. But these are the data for the other part. So my favorite one is an experiment done at the Cornell Hotel School. Now, I don't know if you knew this, but I didn't know that the Cornell Hotel School had a research arm, but it does, curiously. And they did this very clever experiment. They went to an upscale Italian restaurant in New Jersey. Actually, I didn't know there was an upscale Italian restaurant in New Jersey either, but apparently there is. And I hope I didn't, anybody from New Jersey? There always is. So listen to what they did. They had a deck of cards, and in that deck of cards were 4 different cards, and the waitresses or wait persons or whatever they are were instructed to pull out a card at random from the deck, and either give no candy at the end of a meal, 1 piece or 2 pieces, or 1 piece and then in a very generous way another piece. And then because they had the tips registered, they could correlate the amount of candy to the amount of tips. And these are the results. So as I said, it was an upscale restaurant and the tips were generous. But with 1 piece of candy, 2 pieces of candy, and 1 + 1, this is only candy. This is not a $1,000 honorarium or a $100,000 retainer from industry. And this, people have known about conflict of interest for a long time. Here's one from Cervantes. It says, it's only right that people who receive a benefit show that they're grateful, even if it's with trifles. And Oscar Wilde said, I can resist anything but temptation. So this says you're healthy, but I have to give you a prescription for Toxikill. The drug company's rep is totally hot, and she said she'd take me to lunch if I sell enough of this stuff. Now, I don't show this slide to titillate you. Instead, I show it because I want to make an important point, and that is that I'm making a distinction here about financial conflict of interest. This is not a financial conflict of interest. So I want to restrict my comments to financial conflict of interest. And the reason is that these kinds of conflicts, social conflicts, prejudices, and all those kinds of things are innate. We can't do much about them. We have them. Maybe we can get rid of some of them with working at it, but we can't, it's very hard to get rid of those. Financial conflicts of interest are different, and they're different because you can either have one or reject one. So if a drug company rep comes to you and says, I want to give you $1,000, $2,000 to come to Coral Gables to give a talk, you can say yes or you can say no. If you say no, you don't have a financial conflict. If you say yes, you do have a financial conflict. It's as simple as all that. And everything I say from now on has to do with financial conflicts of interest. So again, these conflicts of interest wouldn't matter much unless they did something bad. And of course, the issue is, do these financial conflicts lead to bias? So here's an example of a treatment that a doctor is giving in his office. I'm not going to go into this in great detail except to say that there's a drug called Natracor that was originally designed to be given to people with heart failure in the hospital. And it started to be getting used in doctors' offices, and people became alarmed about it. So the company that made the drug, Johnson & Johnson, to their credit, put a panel together of very distinguished cardiologists to look at whether the drug was being appropriately given or not. And the panel met and decided that they shouldn't be given in doctors' offices. It was too risky. There was kidney failure, there was rhythm disturbances and things like that. So they recommended that it should be given only in the hospital. So Stephanie Saul in the New York Times some years ago wrote this quote, which I'm going to read. She said, Dr. Larry Altschul, a cardiologist in West Islip, New York, who regularly treats 70 patients with Natracor infusions, said he did not expect the committee's report to change his use of the drug. We have quite a few people that are on this and are doing wonderful on this thing. He said, we're ethically bound to continue this medication because of what we see it's doing in the appropriate patient. Now then, she said, Medicare pays for most of the outpatient treatment. It's at a rate of $600 per infusion. That doesn't include the doctor's fee. So this fellow is making a huge amount of money, and he's convinced himself that he's ethically bound to do so. Now, maybe he believes that. One of the problems with financial conflict of interest is that a lot of the beliefs are not conscious. People don't realize that they're doing what they're doing. And this is one that I think will, as the expression goes, knock your socks off. So this is a very interesting study, and I'm going to try to explain it. It's a little complicated. So there's a group of lawyers who were suing a company for the development in their workers of lung disease caused by inhalation. It's called pneumoconiosis. And the x-rays of these workers had been read by 30 radiologists who were reading the x-rays in a very specific way according to federal guidelines at NIOSH. So there were 492 abnormal chest x-rays that had been read by 30 radiologists who were working for the lawyers who were suing the company. Okay? So they have a bit of a conflict. And then they had, this group in Sweden had the same x-rays read by 6 radiologists who did not have any connection with the lawyers. And they were independent readers. They all read them the same way. And these are the results. So if you look at the top line and the bottom line, the hirees are the radiologists who were hired by the lawyers to read the films. They thought that there were abnormalities in the lungs 96% of the time. The independents, who didn't know any connection at all, thought that there were only 5%. And the films were read to be normal by none of the hirees, but 38% of the independents. Now, I submit you don't need 3 statisticians from the Harvard School of Public Health to tell you that there's something fishy about these numbers. There is clearly an evidence of, in my opinion at least, of bias in the way x-rays were read. And these are just reading x-rays. And this is a decision made by the FDA that you're probably well familiar with. This had to do with Vioxx. And you may remember back in the old days of 2005 that there was an advisory board of the FDA that voted on whether or not certain of these of these specific drugs, including Celebrex, Vioxx, and Bextra, should be kept on the market. And it was clear that the vote for Celebrex was unequivocal, 31-1, 17 in favor of Vioxx, and 15 opposed. That was really quite close, as it was for Bextra. It turned out that Gardner Harris did a little investigation and found that the decision was heavily weighted toward the people who had financial ties with industry. So those who had financial ties in the very center bar of the figure voted 9-1 for both to keep on the market, whereas those who had no known ties were virtually split, in fact, on the negative side. And if you had excluded those who had financial conflicts of interest, then Vioxx would not have been kept on the market. Later, by the way, it was removed for different reasons. So there you have another reason for worrying that these financial conflicts of interest have an impact on the decisions that physicians make. And there are other clinical practice guidelines besides the cholesterol guidelines that have been tainted by financial conflicts. The use of androgens in elderly men, COX-2 inhibitors in the elderly, clot busters for stroke, implantable defibrillators, and so forth. The problem is that when you put a group of people together who have the same background, there's a tendency to think the same. So the military actually has a notion for this called groupthink. It's basically intellectual conformity, and it's called incestuous amplification. And they call it a condition in warfare where one only listens to those who are already in lockstep agreement, reinforcing set beliefs and creating a situation ripe for miscalculation. This comes from Jane's Weekly. Now, I think that if you look at our recent wars, you might appreciate that it's quite relevant to these conflicts as well. So the question is, how do you interpret expert opinion then? Suppose I was a speaker here recommending a Pfizer drug, and you knew that because I declared it, that I was making $2,000 for this lecture paid by Pfizer. And I'm telling you about the merits of this Pfizer drug. I could have said Merck or GSK or whatever. How would you interpret that? You're having real difficulty knowing whether or not my disclosure is meaningful. That's the problem with disclosure. And disclosure is the solution to all conflicts of interest. My point is, disclosure is only a partial solution to conflict of interest. It's not a final solution. It is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So again, what do you make of people that get up and give lectures on the benefit of a drug who all know that they are making money based on the drug? What does it mean? Are they being nasty? Are they trying to hurt patients? Of course not. This is more subconscious than anything else. The problem is that it requires mind reading to figure out what's going on. So here's a guy. Does anybody know who this guy is? His name is Mark Felt. Deep Throat. So Mark Felt is Deep Throat. Everybody is trying to figure out when Mark Felt came out of the closet, what was he thinking? And the answer is, by the time they got to him, he was probably already a bit senile. So he might not have known what he was thinking even back then. The problem is, a lot of this requires mind reading. And here's some examples of mind reading. Tarot cards, magician, seasonal, cups. I have no idea what these things are. So what do we do about this? Well, I think that if you're going to put panels together to make recommendations for doctors, then they ought to be a lot of independent people and diversity on the panel, not everybody the same. There ought to be experts, but experts in analyzing data. And if we're going to have conflicted people, okay, let's have them, but minimize them. And the problem, one of the big problems, is this one here. So it says, when you're ambulatory, be sure to check out my line of post-op merchandise in the gift shop. Now, this, when cartoonists start putting out things like this, it means that there's a lack of trust or a loss of trust in the medical profession. And of all the things that worry me, it isn't so much that a patient might get the wrong drug or a more expensive drug, although that's a real worry, but that people will no longer trust their doctors. That is a really problematic thing. So going back to the principles I espoused before, I believe that gifts can bias therapeutic choices, that biased information can lead to flawed clinical outcomes, that marketing promotes the latest and the most expensive treatments, that financial arrangements are largely hidden, and that conflicted researchers can endanger patients' welfare. I really didn't talk about that, but I'd be glad to answer questions about it if you'd like. And finally, that it injures professionalism and the profession and damages the trust between doctors and patients. So when I give talks to physicians, I describe the so-called slippery slope. And I advise them not to take reprints from the drug reps because the reprints they're going to get are likely to be biased. Not to take pens and coffee cups, and not to take even textbooks and stethoscopes, which the AMA allows them to take. No lunches, no pizza, no dinners, and no travel, and no continuing medical education from the drug companies. They should not be on speakers bureaus. They should, I'll skip stock and stock options. And they should not be consultants on marketing issues. However, I have urged physicians to continue to work with industry on scientific issues, because if they consult with industry on new drugs or new devices, that's good for patients. Even let them make money on that as long as it's good for patients. And it's also true of joint research with industry. That, to me, is a good thing, not a bad thing. Now, I wrote the book in 2005, and in 2006, I collaborated with a group of colleagues to write a piece in the JAMA that got a lot of attention and had an impact, I think, on what people have been doing. And I'll tell you a little bit about what has happened since then. In many medical schools, conflict of interest guidelines have been rewritten, and in some medical schools, though very few, physicians are no longer allowed to participate in speakers bureaus. Many institutions have banned free samples with the notion they allow those samples to be brought to the pharmacy, but not to be given off piecemeal by any one of the physicians. Some academic medical centers, many of them, have banned free meals and gifts and have taken the pharmaceutical reps away from the house staff, at least in the halls of the hospitals, even though they go out for dinner with them at night. The most interesting part is the recent addition to the new healthcare law, which requires that as of 2013, all pharmaceutical companies must disclose the gifts that they give to physicians, anything more than $50. So that will now produce a large database for which anyone will be able to search. Well, I hope anyone will be able to search, depending on how complex the database is. And you know about this book, which is now available on Amazon for, I think, $3.15, maybe $4.20, something like that. And so it's really no longer a conflict of interest for me. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Dr.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Kassirer. The question I have is has to do with the New England Journal of Medicine. I think you're familiar with that. Do they, knowing that advertisements lower the cost of that journal to physicians, has the New England Journal made the decision to no longer have advertisements from drug companies?
Well, if you've looked at the most recent issue, you'll see that there's plenty of drug ads in the journal. And when I was the editor from 1991 to 1999, there was also plenty of drug ads in the journal. So when I joined the editorial staff, when I became the editor, I had a choice, either to say to them, I'm not going to take the job unless you get rid of the ads, or I'll swallow it and take the ads as they were. So I took the job. And you could say, well, you compromised yourself. And, you know, you could make that argument. What we did was to ensure that there was no correlation between anything in the ads and any article in the journal for that week. And the way we did that was we had a front page that was there were ads next to the front page. There aren't any more. So every week we checked that front page to see what the ad was to make sure that it didn't correlate with the first article in the journal. And secondly, we had a certain restriction on the amount of ads per issue and per year. And also the ads are at the beginning and at the end, and they don't mix in as many other journals do. So, you know, we tried to do our best to try to make sure that there was no correlation between an ad, and I never knew what ads were going to be in there, and neither did the ad people know what the articles would be in the journal for that week. It's probably the best we could do. Now, why didn't the Mass Medical Society agree to get rid of the ads? They made a fortune on them. I mean, it wasn't that they paid for the journal. It wasn't that they reduced the price of the journal by taking ads. It's that they made $20 million a year profit on top of it. So to try to get them to give that up was a lost cause.
So it's an imperfect system.
Absolutely. No question about it. Now, you know, of course, that there are journals now that are online that take no ads. The journal Open Medicine, for example, I'm on the board of Open Medicine, takes no ads and barely makes it on the skin of their teeth because you have to have somebody to do the editing. So you have to pay people to do editing. And the way they're doing it is they are using people who are being paid by universities to edit the journal. And that's not fair either. Other journals are charging page charges because in some way you've got to be able to pay for good editing. Otherwise, all you have is Wikipedia. Now, you know, I'm not saying that Wikipedia is all that bad. It isn't. You know, in fact, even though it's flawed, it's very good. And it was made out of whole cloth. I mean, you all made Wikipedia, and I made Wikipedia. So some of these online sources can be very, very good. Not just Open Medicine, PLOS Medicine is another one, the Public Library of Science Medicine, another one of these journals that have no advertising. And it's a high quality journal. It's only a few years old.
Is it a referee journal?
Say it again?
It's a referee journal?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I have one other question. What percentage of medical schools do you think have a lecture such as we just heard tonight as part of their curriculum? Would you give us an estimate of that?
Oh, yeah, I think probably almost all do now. That wasn't the case 5 years ago, but now what has happened is that a lot of medical schools across the country have developed courses in medical ethics. And part of the course in medical ethics, among how to talk to patients and what a controlled trial is and everything else associated with that is conflict of interest. So many medical schools have. I've actually given lectures at many of them. There must be more questions.
Could you comment on AMSA's report card system?
AMSA's report card system. Refresh my memory.
AMSA, the American Medical Student Association.
Right. Oh, yeah. Good. Yeah.
Can you repeat the question on the
No,
microphone?
I'll repeat it for him. The question was, what about the policy of the American Medical Student Association's report card? And the answer is that it's very well done. This is the American Medical Student Association is not part of the American Medical Association. It's a completely separate organization, though they get their funds. I don't remember. You don't remember where they get their funds?
From membership.
From dues, yeah. So it's a separate, independent organization, and they rank medical schools according to their conflict of interest policies, and it's pretty good. Yes, sir.
I'm still thinking about those Canadians that you started out with, and wondering if they did not have any financial ties.
They
to
had
drug
none.
companies? They had none.
None.
I
It's a
wonder
group
why
called
that is.
Therapeutics Initiative at the University of British Columbia, and you can actually find them online. They have no financial conflicts of interest. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting. I'm glad you mentioned it because there's a movement in Canada to privatize medicine. I mean, big mistake, I think. Look at the experience we've had. I think some disasters. But in Canada, there's a bill in the legislature to withdraw money from the University of British Columbia because of the Therapeutics Initiative. The initiative is the bill is paid for by the pharmaceutical industry in Canada. So they're trying to get rid of the Therapeutics Initiative because they're basically producing objective material. They don't, and the pharmaceutical companies don't like it. Pretty bad.
This may not be a question totally on point, but I'm wondering if you've done any investigation with insurance companies and the conflicts that we're seeing currently with insurance companies and our physicians.
I did not hear your question.
Let me ask it again. This may not be on point with your lecture tonight, but have you looked into any of the conflicts of interest with insurance companies and our physicians? Insurance companies.
If I understand your question, have I looked at the issue of how insurance companies make decisions?
No, in terms of how they have conflicts of interest and the way they are influencing our physicians. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's a bit of a mess, to be frank. I'm not exactly sure where to start. Let me start with physicians and then go on to talk about the insurance companies. So when you think about how you pay physicians for what they do, there is no incentive-free system. So if you pay them on a piecemeal basis for every test they order, every treatment they give, then they'll order more and more and more. Again, may not be conscious, but they do that. I was mentioning before, for example, that if you compare the same population of people in Florida and in Michigan, the number of tests done in Florida is 3 times the amount in Michigan with the same outcomes because there are more specialists there. They order more tests, and they can order more tests. So on a fee-for-service basis, you get too much tests. So then if you start paying physicians on a capitated basis, a certain amount of money per year for every patient, then they order fewer tests. And in fact, they may order too few tests. And then you could say, well, what about paying physicians on a salary basis? What kind of incentive is there? Well, the incentive there is to go home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and not do the work. So there is no incentive-free system. So now you take the insurance companies and you ask yourself, what do the insurance companies want to pay for? The answer is nothing. I mean, they want profits. So the less money that they spend on medical care, the better off they are. And so in any kind of system where there's a financial incentive, the only way you can control it is to have some kind of controls over the group, physicians, insurance companies as well. And that's what the big fuss is all about. So we're trying to spend less money on medical care in our country. And the big question, how do you do that? How do you restrict the money that doctors are going to order for patients without the patients thinking to themselves, I'm being cheated, I'm not getting adequate medical care? The same with the insurance companies. So if the insurance companies say, we're not going to pay for sentinel node biopsy in breast cancer anymore because the evidence shows X and Y, some people are going to be very unhappy about that. The use of bone marrow transplantation for breast cancer, a perfect example. So we started out by taking the worst kind of patients, those who were terminal breast cancer patients. I shouldn't have used the word worst kind. Obviously, the patients that were in the worst case, the worst trouble, and transplanted the bone marrow with the idea that you could kill all the cancer cells and reconstitute their bone marrow. There was never an experiment that showed that that was beneficial. But we did it, and the insurance companies paid for it for a while. And then there were begun to have some controlled trials which showed that it didn't work. The people died more often or faster. So the insurance companies withdrew it, and I think properly so. So it's that fine line between what do you pay for, what's efficacious, is where we are. We're trying to walk that fine line, and we haven't gotten there yet.
My question is related to some of the data that you had there. I'm not a physician, but I'm a scientist, and so when I saw the results of both the statins study that you talked about, and also the I'm trying, it slips me now, another study that'll come to me. But what I'm curious about is how, if everybody's subscribing to evidence-based medicine, let's just assume they all were, all of these very well-educated and respected scientists who are on these panels and such, reviewing these very good studies, how could they possibly have the results that you showed if they're all looking at the same data? Does that would tell me that either the evidence is so weak, so statistically weak that it's a coin toss, or the problem with ethics is very severe when people's health are at stake. And it was so astounding to see the difference between the Canadian and the American results on the same data, like a chest X-ray. It's either there or it's not, and yet the data there shows that people are seeing things that aren't there. So how do you explain that as a physician?
I think you've put your finger on some of the issues already. One point is that the data are not always as clean as you'd like it to be. And in many instances, you just don't have an adequate sample of material to be confident that the data are solid. So there's a difference in interpretation. And that flexibility allows people to see it differently. It's peculiar, but people do see data differently, unfortunately. Part of it is the data themselves. They're not quite as neat as you'd like them to be. In situations where there's a lot of data and the data are solid, there's virtually no difference in the way people interpret it. But where there's a lot of flexibility, it's up for grabs.
In reading your book, there's a lot of information about the potential, the conflict of interest. But are there any surveys that indicate times when that conflict of interest has resulted in improper medical care, so that you can document that and pursue it.
So the question is, have there been situations in which the conflicts of interest have yielded inappropriate medical care? Well, since you read the book, you probably read the chapter in which I talk about the approval of certain drugs by the FDA. And there's one example in there of the approval of a drug that caused liver damage, and I can't remember the name of it. You probably remember it better than I know. A drug that caused liver damage that was kept on the market long after it was removed from the market in Britain and caused 60 or 70 deaths in the United States until it was finally removed from the market. And the panel that voted to keep the drug in the market was heavily conflicted with the company. Just one example. There are plenty of others. Are you getting tired? You can tell me and I'll tell what you say.
Are there any studies that look at hospitals? Are there any studies that look at healthcare in hospitals and cost per patient for nonprofit hospitals versus for-profit?
Yes. So the question was, are there studies that look at the cost of care in for-profit versus not-for-profit hospitals? The answer is yes. I don't have them on the top of my head, but I can tell you how to find them. And that is, go to Google and put in for-profit versus not-for-profit hospital cost. And if you can't find it, then send an email to jpkassirer@aol.com, and he'll find it for you.
Hi, I work in an outpatient dialysis facility.
Where are
I'm
you?
up here.
Oh. You work in an outpatient dialysis
Correct.
facility. Uh-huh.
I think it was Vioxx that was one of those for liver damage. That's what they were discovering. That's why it eventually got off the market. One of my recollections. But I was wondering specifically with you, your interest. You said nephrology at the beginning, so my interest was perked. Your interest, and I do work in a facility where the physician asks pharmaceutical reps to leave the building immediately. So I'm very proud of that. But I think one way to influence also is through staffing, because staff are very influenced by what the doctor says, but if the staff themselves get a little education about what the pharmaceutical companies are doing, it really helps them to understand why. Because we've done a tremendous amount of education on our staff to let them have some understanding about what it means for a pharmaceutical rep to come in. The pens are nice, but...
So I'm not quite sure I got the gist of your whole question, but it was that the pharmaceutical reps are helpful in educating the staff?
Our medical director does that. But I was curious about, you mentioned nephrology at the beginning, what your interest is in nephrology.
I trained in nephrology, yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So that was your interest.
So when I looked at nephrology in 2003, I found enormous numbers of conflicts of interest. And the chair of medicine at Boston University and I went to the American Society of Nephrology, gave a talk, and we were loudly booed at the particular time. They've done a lot better since then. But one of the problems is EPO. EPO is a perfect example of how the pharmaceutical companies have pushed EPO. For those of you who don't know EPO, it's a hormone that stimulates the bone marrow, made by the kidney, stimulates the bone marrow to produce red blood cells. And it's very effective. But the pharmaceutical companies push doctors to push the EPO, push it hard, and got the blood counts to such high levels that patients developed hypertension and strokes.
Right.
And until it was found out that by a study that the drug, that they were pushing too hard, and now they've backed off. But the thing is that the dialysis units made money based on how much EPO they gave. And that's why it was, here's another example.
It's a great example. One of my other points was just to educate the staff that are there in offices in particular, maybe not so much in the hospitals, but in outpatient facilities, to educate them about what the pharmaceutical reps are doing, because it's provided a lot of education to staff for us.
Yeah, you have to be very cautious about taking the direct advice from the pharmaceutical reps. You have to look at the data yourself. It's hard, but that's what you have to do.
Hi. I want to go back, and maybe a little impolitic, but it's something I've puzzled about for 30 years in my career. When you mentioned about the disincentive of a salary for physicians, nurses, social workers, occupational therapists, all the other health professions work typically for a salary. And so I'm curious, it's always been interesting to me that that's been held out, as that would somehow or other be disincentivizing. And, and that concerns me.
A good question. I can tell you that I was salaried for my entire career. And there are most healthcare workers do their job. My point was that there is no incentive-free system, and some people are influenced by the way they're paid. And I liked it. I liked the idea that I had no incentive to do more or to do less.
Another question for you. I think you mentioned in your lecture something about the FDA, but I recently read an article in Forbes magazine about a company called Mankind, who actually developed an instrument for testing diabetes and actually administering insulin. And this company went to the extent of building a plant in Connecticut, hired 400 people. Last week they laid off 300 people because the FDA did not approve this piece of equipment. And I'm just wondering, if someone had that much confidence, and this person, Mr. Mann, who actually developed this piece, he had at least 3 other things that had been approved by the FDA, but this was not approved. And he must have had so much confidence to actually build a plant. The company's actually in California, but they had this production facility in Connecticut. Is the FDA being influenced by other companies who already have something that would do the same job?
Well, I just finished reading a 700-page book on the FDA by Daniel Carpenter, who's a professor at Harvard. And if you really would like to understand what the FDA does, that book is really a must-read. It's a huge thing, but by the time you finish this book, you will really understand the complexities of the world in which the FDA lives. They are influenced by Congress, they're influenced by drug companies, they're influenced by patients, they're influenced by medical societies, by patient societies, and they, at the same time, they are trying to balance the risk versus the benefit of the drugs that are referred to them for approval. It's a very difficult job because they have certain standards that they adhere to determine whether or not a drug is beneficial. At the same time, when you begin to use the drug in the community, you sometimes don't see the complications that occur, you may see complications that you haven't seen in a short study. So they're in the catbird seat. They're having incredible difficulty because they're not only in a scientific mode, but in a political mode. And they try their best, I think, to approve drugs that are safe and beneficial. Those are their two mandates. At first it was only beneficial. Now it's beneficial and safe. So I feel bad for people that have lost their jobs when a drug isn't approved. But all I can say is there probably was a good reason why it wasn't approved. Say it again?
I didn't know if you'd had any direct experience with the FDA in terms of, I'm sure they've had things go both ways.
No, only that I've read about them for 50 years.
In one of the first lectures at this seminar, Dr. Ford from the University of New England, who does research on water, had talked a little bit about how there's a whole theory that water is the cause of some of the Crohn's and colitis issues that have really increased over the last few years in the Western world. And one of the concerns he has is that all the money from the drug companies goes towards curing people who have those symptoms rather than finding out what the source of that is. And how is it that research money can be put towards finding the source when there's no financial benefit for the drug companies?
See, that's a really important question. Not sure where to begin, except to say that the drug companies are in the business of making drugs. They are going to be interested in doing research on something that will produce a profit for them and and money for their stockholders. If I can enlarge your question a little bit, I would say that the issue is, why is it that we spend so much money on treatments and so little on prevention? We've failed to prevent obesity. We've failed to prevent asthma, which now we know is almost certainly related a lot to particulate matter in the air as well as other things. And we have failed to look very carefully at the water supply as well, because I think there are certain areas where it's not just Crohn's disease, but cancer that may have been caused by contaminants in the water. So we just don't have the guts to say we should be spending our money in different ways.
I wondered if you had looked into the situation in other countries compared to ours as far as conflicts of interest.
Sure.
Somehow I don't think of that in England or Canada being
right.
as much of a problem.
Well, there's
here,
a good
but
reason.
I don't know that.
There's a good reason. Most drugs are made by American pharmaceutical companies. There are some foreign ones too, some large foreign ones. But there's no incentive in most countries to prescribe drugs. In England, doctors don't make any money for prescribing drugs. And in other countries, there are two exceptions are France and Japan. And if you want to read more about them, there's a new book by Mark Rodwin. He's in Boston at law school, around the corner from me. I can't even think of the name of it. He actually spent time in France and Japan and found that that when there's an incentive to prescribe drugs, the drugs are prescribed. But in other countries, like Canada, England, there is no incentive to prescribe.
First off, I really enjoyed your book. We read it for our class.
Did you read the whole thing?
Yes. I just had a question. Throughout the whole book, my feeling, and through the lecture, I think it's really important from an educational perspective to focus on the idea of teaching ethics and morals within the profession, but at the same time, in the society that we live in, it's centered on the market and on money and on making money. So isn't the bigger issue, as opposed to ethics and morals, more about the privatization of the medical industry itself? Isn't that the bigger issue? Wouldn't it be more pertinent to spend time, money, and energy on focusing on breaking down the private industry of pharmaceuticals as opposed to teaching people ethics in medicine? Not that ethics in medicine isn't important, of course it is, but...
So who would make the drugs? I mean, that's the problem. The government is never going to do enough research to produce the kind of drugs that the pharmaceutical industry produces. So the incentive of producing a blockbuster drug is a big thing that allows the drug company to invest a lot of money. $200 billion on a drug that sometimes, as pointed out earlier, fails. So the private industry has to do it. And so the issue for me is how to control private industry in a way that they don't do things that are counterproductive for the health and welfare of patients. So I think you've probably heard enough. Thank you very much.